I'd like to share with you a family recipe, one that I know by heart. I learned it from my grandmother, Peg Cunard. Peg was born in 1914, on the very day that World War I broke out in Europe. She was from Missouri, although she pronounced it Missouri, and she married my grandfather at age 17 before winding up in Omaha, Nebraska. My Grandpa Art had been transferred to Omaha by the Army Corps of Engineers to design dams and levees to straighten out the Missouri River and to make room for farms and silos and cattle, and eventually Starbucks and McDonald's and IHOPs. If my Grandma Peg was anything, she was a consummate cook. Wearing aprons that she sewed herself, she pitted and canned cherries that grew in her backyard. She baked her own bread, always had homemade cookies, cleaned and cooked the pheasant and trout that my grandfather shot and caught, and every Sunday supper made 2 kinds of meat, a potato dish, a vegetable, a salad, a bread, and at least 2 desserts, often a cherry pie with a homemade crust. When my Grandma Peg died, I inherited her recipe box. It's about 2 feet long and contains more than 1,400 handwritten recipes on index cards. Now, the dessert section contains the most cards. Grandma Peg had a sweet tooth. In addition to the cakes, pies, and pastries, many of the recipes are for cookies, bars, brownies, or balls. And the recipe I want to share with you is the dessert called date-puffed rice balls. Date-puffed rice balls is a recipe that, like all other recipes, says something about the food's ethnicity, class origin, historical period, authorship, and connection to a specific community of recipe writers. For one, the name of its author, Florence Anderson, tells us something about the writer's gender and locale. Florence Anderson, meaning son of Andrew, is almost certainly an Anglo-American woman whose family immigrated from England to the United States. She also probably grew up at a time when Florence was a common female name, which means between 1880 and 1940. It's also clear that this recipe circulated among a community of cooks, because while it's in my Grandma Peg's hand, it's attributed to someone else. So obviously, women were trading these recipe cards. Now, to make date-puffed rice balls, you'd probably have been a middle-class consumer familiar with American convenience foods. You'd have to know what puffed rice is and be able to afford this mass-produced cereal product. You'd also have to believe that ball-shaped desserts were worth making in the first place. They were quite fashionable back in the 1940s and 50s, especially around the holidays. And then there's my Grandma Peg's annotation above the title, where she's put the word good. She's actually engaging a kind of assessment here, where certain recipes got a thumbs up, others were marked so-so, or even don't make again. Now, why my Grandma Peg kept recipes she never intended to make again, I actually cannot say. Maybe she wanted the record of having tried it, to make sure she didn't forget. So, after the title, author, and a thumbs up or a thumbs down, we get a list of ingredients, which is typical for any recipe. And this list signals the historical and cultural context of the recipe. For instance, an ingredients list might indicate that a recipe calls for industrial agricultural products, such as corn oil, or that it's reliant on consumer culture, if it calls for Hershey's chocolate or Lay's potato chips. Or it might express regionalism, if there's bean sprouts or blue crab meat in the dish. Or, too, that it comes from the culinary traditions of a certain ethnic group, such as tortillas or ginger. A list of ingredients also alternates between what I'm going to call chef speak, with words like soufflé, fricassee, and reamer, and then there's cook speak, such as fry, casserole, and juice. These words can create a more intellectual or a more conversational tone, making the recipe seem more domestic or more professional. And many ingredients lists are rife with sense-based imagery. In a recipe for a roasted leg of lamb, given by Ellen Malloy at the end of her humorous food essay called Eat Your Pets. She writes, "Remove the excess fat from a leg of lamb. Rub the outside of the meat with olive oil, the inside with salt and pepper, and then stuff it with garlic cloves and a thatch of cilantro. Tie the meat with dental floss, unflavored, unwaxed, then crush a few tablespoons of juniper berries in your fingers." The phrases, excess fat from a leg of lamb, a thatch of cilantro, dental floss, unflavored, unwaxed, and juniper berries crushed in your fingers are all as vivid and sharp as the imagery you'd find in a poem. Finally, an ingredients list states the necessary measurements for each item. In the United States, this focus on measurement comes from Fannie Farmer's 1896 Boston Cooking School cookbook, which published standard measurements for the first time. It's only after Fannie Farmer's book that measuring spoons, cups, and bowls became regular kitchen appliances. Okay, what this means is that the ingredients list from my Grandma Peg's recipe for date-puffed rice balls conveys something about the historical period of its writing. It makes a consumer culture reference to Rice Krispies. It uses measurement terms such as cups and tablespoons. And it includes the word oleo, which is from the Latin oleum, meaning oil, an abbreviation of oleomargarine, a butter substitute that was sold during wartime rationing up through 1949. The language of this recipe, then, recalls a time around World War II when the words Rice Krispies, tablespoons, and oleo were in common use. So my grandmother used the language of her particular kitchen culture. Yet I also want to push us further and think of a recipe not just as an historical document or an instruction manual. For a recipe is also a story. It sets a scene, forms a plot, arrives at a climax, and ends with a denouement. And as readers, we become the main characters in these stories, for we're the ones who have to make the magic of turning ingredients into dishes. So recipes are both collaborative and embodied, which is a unique form of writing. Now, I realize it's probably odd to hear me say that recipes are stories, because if there's any story here, it's surely nothing more than a how-to one. How to bake a cranberry cake, how to cook polenta, or how to make date-puffed rice balls. Yet, if you think about how an ingredients list imagines a kind of setting, the instructions in a recipe start to form a narrative arc from beginning to middle to end. And even the finished product might seem like a happy or a tragic climax, depending on how the recipe turns out. And then finally, the plating, the serving suggestions, and maybe the calorie count could become the denouement. All of a sudden, then, a recipe becomes something more than the sum of its parts. So in order to enter the story of date-puffed rice balls, you will need first to set out 1 stick of oleo, a half cup of sugar, and 1 cup of finely chopped dates on your kitchen counter. But instead of introducing a cottage in the woods or a castle on the hill, this once upon a time recalls a 1950s American kitchen. The cheerful hanging hot pads and wooden spoon that decorate my Grandma Peg's recipe card reinforce this image. Then, the story of date-puffed rice balls becomes a set of directions. As with all recipes, these directions are given in a series of imperative phrases that begin with verbs in the present tense. Heat, add, cook, mix, roll. All recipes sound a little bossy. A reader is told exactly what to do. And yet, recipes also invite readers to participate in the unfolding of that story. Recipes are collaborative tales. A writer and a reader co-create meaning in them. So, if the recipe for date-puffed rice balls is actually made, then the world beyond the writing is transformed. The words become the flesh of the reader herself. And it's this three-dimensional reading experience that makes recipes so fascinating to me, especially as the foundation for food essays, or what I'm going to call edible essays. Reading recipes is both a literal and a figurative act. To consume a recipe is to eat it with your eyes, your mouth, and your mind all at once. So if you record your own taste memories in a series of edible essays, you can widen the circle of your culinary memories from the individual to the familial, and then to the communal, even to the national or the global. So with this complexity in mind, let's take a moment to have you get out a scrap of paper and write down a recipe you know by heart. Now, don't overthink this. Even if you don't identify as a foodie, or if you think of yourself as a bad cook, I am sure you still have a few recipes in your head. You might be the kind of person, like me, who's made your favorite chocolate chip cookies so often that you don't have to look up the ingredients or the instructions. But remember that making s'mores or a fried egg sandwich, these are also recipes. Now, once you're done jotting down this memorized recipe, let's consider its title and subject matter. What does it tell you about yourself, your family, and the country and time period in which you live? And how does the recipe reflect the personality of you, its author cook? Then think about the story your recipe tells. Maybe it invokes a traditional Italian meal with violin music, a red and white checkered tablecloth, and a candle guttering in an old Chianti bottle. Or maybe it is a fresh seasonal dish that brings to mind the chilly and foggy landscape of Northern California with its seafood, farmers markets, and local wines. Whatever the setting or situation of your recipe, there's sure to be a story waiting to be played out the moment your reader starts to assemble the dish. My point is that there's a lot you can learn about yourself and your own cooking community in the recipes that you make again and again. So one way to launch an edible essay is to start with well-known recipes that you or your family and friends make often. Then read them closely for their gastronomic language, their culinary imagery, their connections to your own culture and ethnicity, and their shape as mini stories. But this is just a start, because even a recipe you know by heart can't tell the whole story. If you don't turn this recipe into some kind of extended writing, then the memories and imagery that are contained within it will ultimately be lost. In my own case, after my daughter Catherine inherits Grandma Peg's recipe box, there won't be anyone in our family who remembers Peg. So, of course, it's likely that eventually her store of recipes will be lost. The cards will disintegrate, or they'll just be thrown away. And this is the moment when the food essayist steps in and saves these clues to the culinary past. This is the moment when recipes have the potential to become something greater than a series of small stories or a set of idiosyncratic keepsakes. For years, I have been captivated by the stories food essays tell. My interest began when I first taught a seminar on the literatures of food. And this interest continued over the years, including my work editing an anthology called Books That Cook, The Making of a Literary Meal. When my students and I read and discuss food essays, what's intriguing is the elasticity of the recipe form. From such simple and functional parts, a list of ingredients followed by a set of instructions, come a multitude of stories. Some recipe essays are elegiac, some comedic. Some use food to launch social commentaries. Others are coming-of-age stories. Still others are a means of expressing familial tensions or reciting the successes and the disasters of the human heart. To give you some ideas, let me offer you a tasting menu of some of my favorite edible essays. Now, these all come from my anthology, Books That Cook, or from a wonderful collection edited by Mark Weingardner called We Are What We Ate. First, if you're interested in how bringing food to a funeral reminds us of the persistence of life and the living, then take a look at Funeral Food by Michael Lee West. Another essay that captures the creative cooking of a dead relative is called In Nancy's Kitchen by Carolyn Grant. On the other hand, if you'd prefer to read an essay that makes food into something funny, try Don't Ask, Just Eat by Gish Jen. It describes some of the Chinese foodways she grew up with, like when she was presented something gorgeous in a greenish bowl that offset the food's glistening curls, and discovered that it was a bowl of bugs. And then there's H is for Happy by the food writing legend M.F.K. Fisher. Her description of childhood bliss, located in a tough, soggy, indigestive, and yet luscious fried egg sandwich, is simply delightful. In turn, Wendell Berry's The Pleasures of Eating makes food into a social commentary. In it, he insists that all moments of preparing and eating food are agricultural acts. And Gita Mita's The Famine of Bengal is a heart-wrenching yet poetic description of hunger, in which she explains that, in 1942, starving East Indians could pay street vendors different prices to see food, to smell food, and to eat food. A piece that tells a coming-of-age tale in learning how to make a dead robin and mud pie is Judith Moore's essay that's called Pie. And two terrific pieces that show the hardships and the love inherent in families when they cook, share, and struggle to get kids to eat food are Charles Baxter's My Son, Eating Dinner, and Maya Angelou's The Assurance of Caramel Cake. Angelou's essay relates how her grandmother once made her a glorious caramel cake, a combination of salty sweetness that left a memory of heaven itself in the mouth. This was after a teacher had slapped her for not speaking. When Angelou returns home from school and sees this cake waiting, her Uncle Willie says, "This cake can't pay you for being slapped in the face, and yet Mama made it just to tell you how much we love you and how precious you are." Okay, so there's a little edible essay tasting menu. But to give you an even better sense of how a recipe can launch a food essay, let me also offer you a few examples from an assignment that I use in my Books That Cook classes. I call this assignment a recipe recollection, and it's another kind of edible essay. In it, my students trace the culinary memory of their own families by researching and then writing about the history of a certain family recipe. It might be a favorite dish or a crazy special dish, but it can also be one that no one likes. It can be a dish that's elaborate or simple, homemade or just straight out of a box. All that really matters is that a recipe recollection must go beyond the history of the dish. It has to relate what taste memories signify about the family who makes it and what they say about the writer. For food is metaphor. It can represent birth or death, love or hate, health or poison, surfeit or hunger, art or commodity, and either the artificial or the natural. Here are a few samples from my students' recipe recollections and what the food in their family recipes represents as metaphor. The first batch, food is culture. Eli Parkyanovich explains that whether we define ourselves as civilized or vulgar has something to do with how food defines us. He writes, "A combination of a desire for class and a monetary deficiency has made my family masters of thrift food shopping. We make rich marinara sauces out of cheap cans of peeled tomatoes and leftover red wine, and also Alfredo sauces by pouring heavy cream, butter, and pepper over hot pasta noodles and tossing until thick." On the other hand, Maggie Stubbs-Doran challenges the distinctions between high and low culture with her defense of instant mashed potatoes. "I don't think I'm not cultured. I think I was raised in a different culture, because not one slightly solidified, thick, lukewarm spoonful of instant mashed potatoes keeps me from thinking of my mom, my brother, the summertime, or The Price is Right. Instant mashed potatoes will always be nostalgic for me, and you would be wise not to ever say anything bad about them." The second group, food is discussed. The same food triggers radically different associations in two different people. While Stacey Hamlet claims an addiction to cranberry orange chutney and puts it on everything from crackers to scrambled eggs, her mother does not think the condiment looks edible or trustworthy. Stacey says, "It reminded my mom entirely too much of casseroles where you can't distinguish each ingredient after they've all been cooked together." And then the most commonplace food causes an aversion in Corey Delaney. Too many holiday cookies made her terribly sick when she was a young girl, forever changing the Christmas ritual of mother baking cookies. Corey says, "A rule of thumb for any bakers with children: don't leave a 6-year-old unattended while seemingly hundreds of unsuspecting cookies are strewn across every flat surface. No good will come of it." And then the third group, food laughs. Ashley Walker Garrison links her New Hampshire citizenship to a debate over real versus fake maple syrup. "This may seem obvious," she explains, "but that store-bought, chemically flavored maple syrup is not real. The following items are figments of your maple syrup imagination. Mrs. Butterworth's Aunt Jemima, sugar-free. If it comes in a clear plastic container with an easy-to-use, no-spill top, you've got a problem." And Melissa Adams undermines the assumption that good cooking is inherited. Despite her grandmother's marvelous abilities in the kitchen, Melissa admits, "I'm not a good cook. I'm the stereotypical cute Bridget Jones type chef who everyone chuckles at as she blows up hot dogs and melts pasta. Any kitchen with me in it should have an 'enter at your own risk' sign." Through these examples, these tasting plates of food as metaphor, I hope it's clear how a recipe recollection essay can make food represent all kinds of ideas and beliefs. And then here's a final example, one from a former student named Molly Fenton, who does a tremendous job of bringing the reader's own body into her essay. Molly writes, "When I think of my birthday blueberry pie, I don't think of illusions or symbols. I think of my mother's tan, strong arms stirring, her eyes blue as berries, her voice laughing. It's not the food that reminds me of books. It's seeing the book on a shelf that reminds me of the pie and my mother." Now, maybe a book about blueberries doesn't stir one memory in you. Maybe you've never made this kind of pie in your life. But for you, it could be a book about meatloaf that conjures up your grandma's wrinkled face, or a song about lemons that invokes your sister. You find that book in your house, that song plays on the radio, and once again, you taste the food in your mouth, feel the crumbs on your chest, and hear the laughter of your family in every reimagined bite. When Molly makes the turn to the second-person you, she moves past the limits of type and ink to insist that the reader help her consume this blueberry pie. In a religious ritual of communion, the participant eats and drinks in remembrance of me, and eating or refusing to eat syrup or cookies or instant mashed potatoes is also an act of remembrance. It is the memory of the body, not the words of a recipe. It is a living memory. Okay, so now it's your turn. To write your own recipe recollection, you should once again choose a recipe from the past, but this time it doesn't have to be one you know by heart. It doesn't have to be cherished or even a well-known recipe at all. The important thing is that the food should evoke your past. The recipe should help you recollect your family, your friends, and your acquaintances, that boy you had a crush on, that teacher you hated, or those neighbors you found either fascinating or repulsive. And the recipe should be linked to a geography of some kind, a sense of place and community. Now, get your hands on the main ingredients, and whether it's grapes or chicken, chickpeas or chocolate, study them, hold them in your hands, taste them, smell them, engage all of your senses. Then build upon what you're experiencing to recreate your memories connected to this food and to this recipe. And then if you have the time and the inclination, use these main ingredients to cook up the dish. And when it's made, study it again, even before putting a bite in your mouth. What other flavors come to mind? As the late, great James Beard wrote, "When I recollect the taste sensations of my childhood, they lead me to even more tastes." When was this food the best for you? When was it the worst? And now, make wider associations, metaphoric, symbolic, connected to literary allusions or common sayings. For instance, if your main ingredient is an apple and your recipe is for apple pie, what does your dish mean in terms of literature or religion? The Bible suggests that an apple represents knowledge as well as evil. Greek mythology gives us the apple of discord as well as the golden apple. And writers from Shakespeare to Thoreau to Dickinson to Bradbury have written essays, stories, and poems about apples and apple pie. Think, too, about what your food means in terms of popular culture, songs, blogs, memes, films. And what are some familiar sayings associated with your food? An apple a day keeps the doctor away. She is the apple of my eye. Or how about Apple and Steve Jobs? Then, after dreaming up and thinking through an imagistic checklist like this, go back to your recipe. This recipe needs to be incorporated directly into your recipe recollection. But how you do so is something to think about carefully. You don't have to list title, ingredients, and instructions all in a row, broken out like a poem or like an instruction manual. In the food essay, H is for Happy, MFK Fisher gives her reader 2 ingredient lists, one for physical ingredients and one for spiritual, to show equal parts of hunger and happiness. On the other hand, the writer Judith Moore collapses years of baking pies into a single paragraph. As a child, rolling out mud crusts, I felt much as I feel now, wearing an apron in my kitchen, that making a pie, I'm handmaiden to a miracle. I will begin, let's say, with pale green and ruby rhubarb, sour red pie cherries, Macintosh apples, butter, sugar, flour, salt, and shortening. I peel the coarse strings off the outer blades of the fruit. Then I spoon the raw fruit into the bottom pie shell, dab it with chunks of butter, dribble sugar, and strew flour. I fold the second round of pie dough and gently lift it onto the heaped high fruit. With a fork, I prick the top crust in several places so that while the pie bakes, steam can escape. A transformation that is almost sorcery begins when the pie is set on a middle rack in the heated oven. This recipe for making and baking pies serves as a kind of synthesis of all past, present, and future pies, their filling sequestered beneath a canopy of top crust, hidden from the eye. It's not the pie itself, but how it functions as a symbol for, as Moore puts it, the enigma of inside and out, like a door, a box, or a body that offers itself for reverie. So, feel as though you can play around with the elasticity and adaptability of your recipe form. And now that you have set out on your writing table the ingredients for a recipe recollection, it's time to assemble it. You might ask yourself, what did this dish mean to me way back when, and why? Has that changed? What does it mean to my family members, my friends or enemies, the folk in my neighborhood, in another nation? What did it mean in the 19th century, in the 11th century? What does it mean when this food is unavailable? Where does the dish come from originally? Is it natural, or is it most of this recipe built from what Michael Pollan has called a food-like substance? Do others believe this dish is inedible, and why? Is this food girly or manly? Is it for old-timers or youngins? Is it sexy, or is it a turnoff? Are the memories of this food crunchy or velvety, sharp or subtle? Are they hard or soft? And why? And why? And why? Ultimately, Your task is to take these ingredients and cook them in such a way that you tell a story that remembers this food at the same time that you reflect on the food's larger meaning. That meaning might be metaphoric, as in some of my students' essays that presented food as disgust. Or it might be symbolic, as when Maya Angelou's caramel cake became a symbol of the grandmother's love for her. Or it might be cultural, as in MFK Fisher's interest in exploring the intangible essence of happiness through childhood moments marked by greasy fried egg sandwiches. The most important thing is your recipe recollection should have at least 3 layers. First, it needs to recreate the recipe in sensual descriptive detail. Second, it should represent the past through recollection. And finally, it should look backwards and be reflective. You need to look back on this taste memory from the perspective of the present moment and ask yourself what it means to you now as well as to your readers. It's this final layer that will bring your reader fully into your food essay. For what is more intimate than eating? Such intimacy suggests a power of empathy and transformation that is at the very center of why we write essays in the first place. The Latin root of the word recipe captures the very essence of this. It means both giving and receiving.